receive story? All right. That's what I like to hear. Good evening, everybody. So tonight we have another dad story of values. Last night's one was one of the best. And tonight is a really important value. And both boys are ready to roll. We've done a pretty decent job tonight of following directions. Both boys are in bed tonight. Last night we had some hiccups, but tonight we are in good shape. So tonight's story, again, to recap, I feel like I have to just introduce this concept every time, just in case it's the first time you're listening or tuning in or reviewing these videos. But this is a story of values books, and this is a series of values books, rather. These values books were mostly what I'm finding were written in the 1970s, late 1970s. And they just give a story about a historical figure and the value, an important value of life that this character embodied or practiced in their day-to-day life. And so it's a really interesting series. We've done a lot so far. Please check out the page. The kids call it a YouTube channel. I don't know if I have a channel or if I am the channel or where I get the channel. But apparently that's kind of the thing. So we are tonight just continuing through the series. And tonight's choice, Nolan's choice tonight, was The Value of Self-Discipline, the story of Alexander Graham Bell. Now, this one was written, again, I kind of like to review this. This one's a little later, actually. This one was written in 1984, 1985. So this is actually one of the later books of the series, not one of the earlier ones so far. I think this is probably the first one that we've looked into that is 1980s. So this is 1985, as I think, when it was copyright. So that's kind of what they look at, I guess. 1985. I was 6 years old in 1985. Is anyone else 6 years old? No? Yes. Oh, Lucas is 6 years old. So it's sort of like if this book were written in 2019, Lucas would be 6 years old, almost 7. But yeah, I was 6 years old in 1985. This is the story of Alexander Graham Bell. Are we ready, boys? Yep. All right, awesome. Here we go. Once upon a time, in Edinburgh, Scotland, there lived a young boy named Alexander Graham Bell. His family called him Alec, and he was a very thoughtful little boy. When Alec's father took him and his brothers for a walk up the hill overlooking the city, Alec would ask many questions. What kind of flower is that, Father? How can birds fly without flapping their wings? What happens to butterflies in winter? Mr. Bell laughed. So many questions, Alec. You'll have to give me time to answer them. Then he would answer Alec's questions one by one. One day, Mr. Bell took Alec to visit a mill where wheat was ground into flour to make bread. As usual, Alec was full of questions. How do you get the hard outside husks off the grain? Alec asked the mill owner. That's a problem, the mill owner replied. It takes a long time to get rid of the husks. What we really need is a new tool to help us. That night, as Alec was washing his hands, he had an idea. Maybe the mill owner could brush the husks off the grain like I brush dirt from my fingernails, he thought. Alec was very pleased with his idea at first. Then it occurred to him that brushing husks off kernels one by one would take far too long. It was hard enough trying to get his nails clean. Later, lying in bed, Alec thought and thought about the problem. Nothing he thought of seemed very good. He was feeling drowsy and discouraged when all of a sudden he thought he heard a voice. "That's a very interesting invention you are working on, Alec," the voice said. Startled, Alec opened his eyes. A little bell was floating in the air above his head. "Who are you?" Alec exclaimed. "Where did you come from? And since when do bells speak?" "I'm Bell," announced the strange little creature. "I have decided to be your friend and give you encouragement when you need it. All inventors need lots of encouragement." "Thank you," said Alex, smiling. He was very proud to be thought of as an inventor. "My father is an inventor," he went on. "He is inventing a way to teach deaf people how to speak. I want to be like him when I grow up." "You will," Alex said his new friend. "You have at least one of the things it takes to become an inventor, a searching mind. It takes self-discipline, too, of course. Lots of self-discipline. You may have to work on that, but I'll help you." Being an honest little boy, Alec felt he had better tell Belle the whole truth. What am I hearing, guys? Am I hearing a toy? Being an honest little boy, Alec felt he had better tell Belle the whole truth. "My invention doesn't work, though." "Not yet, but you can improve it if you try hard enough. Keep looking around you. The world is full of ideas, but you have to discipline your mind to search them out." The next day, Alec visited the mill with his father again and looked carefully at everything. He spotted a barrel-like machine that had paddles inside and a handle that turned it. "That's it," he shouted. He was so excited that at first the workers couldn't understand what he was talking about. When he had calmed down enough to make himself clear, they talked it over. Brushes instead of paddles. It might work," one said. "They could pass over lots of grain again and again," added another. "It's worth a try," they agreed. So they tried it, and it worked. And Bell was right. If he disciplined himself to work on a problem, he could solve it. If there was a problem, he'll solve it. It's not in the book. That's just my own made up words. It's actually not my own made up words. From that day on, Alec was forever thinking up new inventions and trying them out. Bell was usually right there with him, very excited when things went well, encouraging Alec when things went wrong. "Don't give up, Alec. Keep looking. It takes lots of self-discipline, but the answer is there somewhere." Of course, Alec knew that Bell wasn't real. He knew that when he heard the bell talk, he was really hearing his own thoughts. But it was fun pretending that he had such a good friend. "After all," he said to himself, "inventing can be lonely work. I need someone to talk to and encourage me." Mr. and Mrs. Bell were proud of their inventive son, but they were a little worried too. "I had hoped he might become a pianist," said Mrs. Bell one night when Alec was 15. "He showed such talent when I was teaching him, but he seems to have lost interest." "I know." What was that? Nolan? Okay, I'm hearing stuff, so I'd like for that to stop so we can continue to read the story and not be distracted by anything. Okay? Lucas? Okay. "I know," agreed her husband. His only interest seems to be inventing. I feel his school work may be suffering too. He's so bright, though, and he wants to learn and know about things," added Mrs. Bell. They both thought for a while. Suddenly, Mrs. Bell exclaimed, "I think I have the answer. Why don't we send him to Grandfather Bell?" Of course. Now, why didn't I think of that? He's enthusiastic, but very disciplined and an excellent teacher, just what Alec needs. So Alec went to London to live and study with his grandfather for a year. The first day, Grandfather Bell took Alec into his library. There were so many books on the shelves that Alec could hardly see the walls. "There's a lot of learning in this room, Alec," said Grandfather Bell. He picked up a book and held it out. "Why don't you start with this?" "Have you read all these books?" asked Alec. "Most of them. They have given me great pleasure." "I don't have to read them all, do I?" Alec couldn't see how there would ever be time for anything else if he did. "Well, maybe not all," laughed his grandfather, "but as many as you can. It's going to take a lot of self discipline, Alec, but you can do it." Later in his room, Alec complained to Belle. "Why do I need to read all these books?" he grumbled. "You said there are ideas all around us in the world. There are ideas in books too, Alec. You've got to keep your mind open to everything. You'll learn a lot, you'll see, and you'll enjoy it too. Self discipline, Alec, self discipline," laughed Belle. Self discipline, muttered Alec. "But I guess everybody is right. It is going to take a lot." They were right, of course, and they were right about something else. Alec's year with his grandfather was hard work, but it was fun, too. At the end of the year, Alec's father came to take him home. "Before we leave, I want you to meet someone, Alec." Alec was overjoyed when he learned it was a famous scientist. While his father and the scientist talked, Alec explored the scientist's workroom. In the corner, he found a machine built to look like a human head. Of course, he had to find out what it was. "What is this?" he asked the scientist. "That's a talking head. I made it many years ago to show how we use our tongue and lips to help us talk. Watch this." The scientist blew into a tube in the back of the machine and moved the lips. And do you know what happened next? The machine talked. This story is deep. Okay. When they got back home, Mr. Bell challenged Alec and his older brother Melville to make their own talking machine. The brothers worked on it every spare minute. Sometimes Melville would get discouraged. "We'll never get it to talk, Alec." "Oh, yes, we will. We just have to keep working at it. There's always something new we can try or a new way of putting what we have together." One afternoon, as Melville blew into its voice box, the machine said, "Ah, we did it," whooped Alec. Bell clanged wildly with joy. "Take it easy, Bell," laughed Alec. "You can get pretty noisy at times." Bell calmed down. Alec tried moving the tongue and lips, and before long the machine said, "Mama," just like a baby. They knew it sounded real when a neighbor knocked at the door and asked if there was a baby crying. Bell and the boys laughed until they hurt. "Congratulations, boys," said Mr. Bell when he heard the machine talk. "Now I have another job for you. I need you to help me teach my alphabet for the deaf." "How does it work, Father?" asked Alec. His work on the machine had made him very interested in speech and sound. "We learn to speak by listening to people," explained Mr. Bell. "Those who are born deaf can't do that, so I've drawn pictures to show them how to hold their tongue and lips to make every sound of the English language. I call it visible speech. If you get discouraged because inventing takes so much self-discipline, Alec, just think how much a deaf person needs in order to learn to make sounds people can understand." For the next few years, Alec and Melville helped their father teach visible speech and give lectures about it to other teachers and scientists. Sitting alone with Bell one day, Alec said sadly, "Mother is becoming deaf." "Yes, I know," replied Bell. "She must feel very cut off from the family, not being able to hear. I am sure she does, but you know, Bell, in a way, she's lucky. At least she knows how to speak. How much more lonely it must be for people who are born deaf and who have never learned to speak." As Alec got more involved with teaching the deaf to speak, he became fascinated with the question of how sound travels. He started doing experiments and enrolled at the university to learn more. While Alec was at the university, tragedy struck the Bells family. Alec's younger brother, who had always been frail, became sick and died of a disease called tuberculosis. A few short months later, his older brother, Melville, died of the same disease. In those days, they did not have the wonderful medicines we have today to cure such illnesses. One day, Alec's mother noticed that his cheeks were flushed and he was very tired. These were signs of the disease that had killed her other two sons. Mrs. Bell was very worried. "There must be something we can do," she said to her husband. "There is. We can take him to a healthier climate." "But where?" she asked. "Canada. I spent some time there many years ago when my health was poor. It did wonders for me, and we have friends in Paris, Ontario. They will help us get settled." So the decision was made. They were sad to leave, but they knew how important it was to Alec's health. Not long afterwards, Alec found himself with his parents on a ship heading for Canada. Alec was on deck when the ship docked in Quebec City. There were people everywhere, unloading boxes and bags, waving to friends and shouting in French. The buildings around the docks were made of wood instead of bricks like the ones in Edinburgh. "Everything looks and sounds so strange, Belle," said Alec. "I know, and you will probably feel a little homesick for a while." Alec agreed, but decided he was not going to let it get the better of him. The Bells found a house in Brantford, Ontario. It was a white house with black trim. "Look, Belle," cried Alec, "what a wonderful big front porch. I am really going to like this." Belle smiled at Alec's enthusiasm. The house was called Tutello Heights. It was built on a hill and overlooked the Grand River, which wound through the valley below. Among the birch trees on the edge of the hill, Alec and Belle found a hollow spot where they could sit and gaze at the view. "I'll bring some blankets and pillows out here," Alec told Belle. "It will be my dreaming place." There, Alec read and dreamed away the summer days. By the time the chilly Canadian autumn chased him indoors, his health was much improved. About that time, Alec's father went on a lecture tour of the United States. While he was in Boston, he explained his visible speech method of teaching deaf people to talk to the head of the school for the deaf. He returned with good news for Alec. The school wanted Alec to teach there. "Do you think you're strong enough yet?" worried Mrs. Bell. "Oh, yes," Alec assured her. "I feel so much better. It'll be fine. I'll miss you, of course." "Promise me you won't work too hard and will get lots of rest." "I promise," said Alec, "and I'll see that you keep that promise." Bell warned Alec later. "An inventor may need to work and have self discipline, but a healthy body is important too." When he got to Boston, Alec went straight to the telegraph office to let his parents know he'd arrived safely. "I'm sorry, sir," the telegraph operator said, "but you'll have to wait. Someone else must be sending a message." "Do you mean only one message can go along the wire at a time?" "That's right. I can't send yours until the line is free." That started Alec thinking. "Bell, there should be a way to send more than one telegraph message at a time. Perhaps I can figure out how to do it." "You probably can," replied his friend, "but it won't be easy. You don't know very much about electricity, so you have a lot to learn." Alec thought about the problem every spare minute. He attended lectures that he thought might help him and read all the books he could find on electricity. Much of his time, of course, was taken up with his classes at the school for deaf. The school was in an old house in the heart of Boston. Although it was full of students, it was a very quiet place. The students had never learned to talk because they couldn't hear what words sounded like. Using visible speech, Alec quickly taught even the youngest ones a few words, and it wasn't long before some of them were speaking whole sentences. Their parents were amazed and very grateful to Alec. One of the most grateful parents was Mr. Thomas Sanders. His 5-year-old son, Georgie, had been deaf since birth. He needed a lot of help, and Alec was teaching him privately. One day, Mr. Sanders approached Alec. "I am delighted with what you have done for Georgie. It gives me great pleasure to see his progress, sir," replied Alec. "I would like to do something for you in return," said the kindly man. "I know you are not earning much money. Would it help if I provided you with a place to stay?" "Why, that would be wonderful, sir." It's settled then. You can move into my mother's house whenever you're ready." It turned out to be a nice large house outside Boston. Mrs. Sanders let Alec use the basement for his experiments. Soon there were wires everywhere. They were strung from wall to wall, from the desk to the windows. Just about anywhere they could be attached. In piles between the wires were books and all sorts of bits and pieces of equipment. One day, Mrs. Sanders came down to see how Alec was doing. She could hardly get in the door because of the wires and piles of books. "Oh my," she said. "Alec, how can you ever find anything in here?" "Well," grinned Alec, "it isn't always easy." Mrs. Sanders shook her head. "You'd better use the attic, too. There's lots of space up there, and the light is better." Alex spent every night in his workshop tinkering with his experiments or reading. Some nights there would be a light in the workshop long after midnight. "Alec, you'll wear yourself out if you keep this up," Belle scolded. "You'll teach all day and work half the night. Self-discipline can include resting when that's what is best for you, even if you'd rather keep working." "I know, Belle, and I'll go to bed soon. But I am getting close to solving the problem. I can't stop now. Maybe if I try." And back Alec turned to his experiments. Belle sighed. "I'm sure glad summer holidays are coming. You need a rest, whether you think so or not." Just before Alec went home to Brantford for the summer, a man came to see him with his deaf daughter. "This is my daughter, Mabel Hubbard," he said, introducing the young woman. Mabel was able to hear and speak until she was 4. Then she lost her hearing, and by now she has forgotten how words sound. She wants to learn to speak again. Alec liked Mabel right away. Although she couldn't talk, her sparkling eyes said a lot. They told him she was a very smart and enthusiastic young lady. Alec also liked Mabel's father. He told Mr. Hubbard about his experiments on the telegraph. Mr. Hubbard was a smart businessman and was very interested. "But Alec, how can you teach and experiment at the same time?" he asked. Alec looked at Mabel. "I love teaching, sir," he said to her father, "and I consider it very important work. I wouldn't think of giving it up." "Well, then you must have someone to help you with your experiments. Let me pay for a helper. After all, you will do something far greater for my daughter. You'll give her back her voice." And so the two men agreed. When Alec returned to Boston in the fall, he would hire a helper at Mr. Hubbard's expense. Alec spent a relaxing summer at Brantford. He read and dreamed in a special dreaming place among the birch trees and dozed off, listening to the wind rustle the summer leaves. But even while he was dreaming, Alec's mind was at work. One lazy afternoon, as the crickets buzzed and the butterflies sunned themselves, Alec told Belle his latest idea. "If we can send code messages over telegraph wires, why not voices? Sometimes the things you think of surprise me," Alec replied. "Belle, it's a wonderful idea." Nolan? What are you doing? Okay. It was such a wonderful idea that Alec couldn't get it out of his mind. He started working on it as soon as he got back to Boston. Now he was teaching at Boston University as well as tutoring deaf students during the day and working on his inventions at night. More than ever, he needed a helper. One day, he wandered into a shop to buy some more wire and equipment for his experiments. It was a crowded, dirty, and very noisy place. Off in the corner, a young man sat hunched over his work as if he were all alone. He didn't seem to hear the noise of the hammers pounding or see the confusion around him. Alec asked the shop owner if he could speak to the young man. Mr. Watson, called the shop owner. The young man didn't even look up. That's the helper for me, Alec whispered for Belle. Anyone who is so self-disciplined he can ignore the mess and the noise in this place won't have any trouble in my workshop. Alec was right. Watson was a hard worker who concentrated so completely on what he was doing that he forgot everything around him. And Alec discovered that Watson was a brilliant mechanic. No matter what piece of equipment Alec needed, Watson could make it for him. Now that he had a helper, Alec had more time for his lessons with deaf students. The lessons that he looked forward to the most were Mabel Hubbard's. Mabel was a very quick learner, and soon she and Alec were having long talks. Mabel would speak slowly, and then she would watch Alec's lips as he spoke. They talked about many things. One day, Alec told her about his idea for a telephone. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could really manage to send voices over a wire? Mabel smiled. In his enthusiasm, Alec had forgotten that, even if he succeeded, Mabel would never hear the voices. It would be marvelous, Mabel said simply. She could understand that it really would be for people who could hear. Besides, anything that Alec cared so much about was important to her. A few days later, Alec and Watson tried their first experiment. They strung a wire from Alec's workshop out the window and into the living room of the house next door. They connected the wire to the neighbor's piano. Alec went back up to his workshop and Watson started to play the piano. Alec held a cup-shaped receiver at the end of the wire to his ear. Could he hear sounds? Yes, he could. He could. Almost jumping for joy, Alec put down the receiver. Then his heart sank. He still heard the sounds. The music had come through the open window between the houses, not over the wire. Our experiment failed, Belle, Alec said glumly. That's too bad, Alec, but don't be downhearted. Remember when you and Melva were working on your talking machine? Alec nodded, but he was still feeling too disappointed to answer his friend. It took you a long time, Belle continued, but with lots of self-discipline and hard work, you made the machine talk. You're right, Belle, replied Alec. There has to be a way to send sounds over a wire, and Watson and I are going to find it. That's the spirit, Alec. Alec and Watson worked hard on their telephone experiments for many months. Oh, yes, it took self-discipline, but they made progress. Meanwhile, Alec spent as much time as he could with Mabel Hubbard. You know, Alec, I think you are falling in love with that young woman, laughed Belle one day. I think you may be right, Belle, as usual, replied Alec softly. Mabel was in love with Alec too. She was also very worried about him. You've got to stop being such a night owl, Alec, she kept saying. I will, but I work best at night. Maybe once I've solved this problem. But there was always some new problem. No matter how long or how hard Alec and Watson worked, nothing seemed to go right. You're tired, Alec, said Mabel. You need a holiday. We all need a holiday. Go home to Brantford for a while. You know your time there always refreshes you. But before you go, I have a present for you. I've been painting your portrait. I'll send it over tomorrow. Alec was packing his suitcase when the parcel was delivered. He opened it and burst out laughing. Mabel's portrait of him was a painting of a great white owl. Night owl. Get it? In Brantford, Alec tried to forget about the telephone as he lay resting in his favorite spot on the hill. Below him, he could see the Grand River, and he could hear the excited voices of children playing on the bank. He thought about how their voices traveled through the air. Suddenly, he had an idea of how to send voices over a telephone wire. He was so excited he couldn't wait to get back to his Boston workshop. I know it will work, Bell. I just know it. Back in Boston, Alex sent for Watson immediately. He explained his idea, and they started to work again that very night. The next afternoon, they strung a wire from the workshop to the spare room next door. Then Watson talked into the mouthpiece in the spare room while Alec listened in the workshop. Alec thought he could hear Watson's voice over the wire, but no matter how hard he listened, he couldn't make out any words. All he could hear was a distant mumble. It was progress, though. Bell jumped around in a frenzy of excitement. Don't be quiet. Do be quiet, Bell, said Alec rather sharply. Bell looked crestfallen. I'm sorry, Alec said, but you're making it hard for me to hear. I'll try to restrain myself from now on, apologized Bell. I guess even I need a little self-discipline. Alec laughed and agreed. Then one March day, something wonderful happened. It was Alec's turn to shut himself in the spare room next door to the workshop and speak into the telephone. Alec was about to sit down at the table that held the telephone when he had an accident. His elbow hit a battery that was sitting on the edge of the desk. It toppled over. Battery acid spilled onto his pants. It was so strong that it burned through his pants and started to sting his skin. Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you, Alec cried into the telephone mouthpiece. Seconds later, a red-faced, excited Watson flung the door open. I heard every word you said, he panted. The first telephone call had been made. Alec was so happy he forgot about the acid and his stinging leg. There is still a lot to be done, Alec explained to Mabel later. The telephone works between rooms that are next door to each other, but to be really useful, it will have to carry voices much farther than that. One day, a few months later, the School for the Deaf had a royal visitor. It was Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil. Dom Pedro wanted to start a similar school in his own country. He asked Alec many questions about visible speech and was very impressed by this young teacher who seemed so bright and dedicated. Alec didn't tell Don Pedro about his inventions. In fact, only the Hubbards and a few of his closest friends knew about the telephone. Alec, it's time you let the world know about your invention, said Mabel one day. Why don't you take it to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia and enter the science contest? I think it's too late, answered Alec. Maybe my father can arrange it, suggested Mabel. And sure enough, Mr. Hubbard did. The exhibition was a huge affair spread over several buildings. One large hall was entirely filled with the latest scientific discoveries. Since Alec had registered late, he was given only a small, out-of-the-way corner of the hall to display his invention. By late afternoon, the science contest judges were hot and tired. They wanted to stop before they had even seen Alec's invention, but one of the judges insisted they take time to see it. Can you guess who it was? It was Dom Pedro. He had recognized Alec and felt sure that whatever this bright young man was showing would be worth seeing. I didn't know you would be here, Mr. Bell, Dom Pedro said. I've come to show my invention, replied Alec. I call it the telephone. Then we must look at it, said the Emperor. When Alec and Watson demonstrated how the telephone worked, the judges were astounded. Each one wanted a turn at listening and speaking into Alec's invention. This is really amazing, they exclaimed. Think of the hard work and self-discipline it must have taken. They all agreed to give Alec first prize. Man, oh man. Getting there, guys. Getting there. Almost getting there. Alec had discussed his telephone idea with his parents when he had first thought of it in Brantford. He had written to them often about his progress, and Mr. and Mrs. Bell were very eager to see how it worked. So after the exhibition, Alec took his telephone home to Brantford. When he got there, he discovered that his friends and neighbors had also heard about his amazing invention. So many came to visit the day he arrived that the house seemed ready to burst. Everyone hoped to see the telephone and try it. That Alec was a special young man, said one neighbor. Always asking questions, said another. I've never known anyone with so much self-discipline, said a third. Alec couldn't demonstrate his telephone for each person one at a time. It would take too long. Finally, he decided to try to send voices over the telegraph wire strung between Brantford and the town of Mount Pleasant, 5 miles away. He invited everyone to gather in the general store in Mount Pleasant to see how his telephone worked. The night he made the call, the general store was filled with people. It was like a party with everyone talking at once. Then, Alec asked everyone to be quiet, and he held the telephone receiver to his ear. The crowd watched his face and saw him smile. Alec could hear voices coming all the way from Brantford. Oh, man. The crowd cheered, and then people took turns listening. To their amazement, they not only heard voices, they understood the words spoken. A few days later, Alec arranged for a telephone call between Brantford and Paris, Ontario, 8 miles away. That call would go down in history as the world's first long-distance phone call. Back in Boston in the fall, Alec successfully made calls between towns many miles apart. Years later, he would also make the first transcontinental telephone call. The telephone company arranged to have Watson waiting in San Francisco, and in New York, Alec repeated the first words ever spoken on the telephone. Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you. Watson remarked that it would take rather long this time. A year after Alec's triumph in Philadelphia, Alec and Mabel were married. They traveled to England, where Alec opened a school for the deaf and demonstrated his telephone to Queen Victoria. The Queen praised Alec's achievement. If more people had your self-discipline, Mr. Bell, just think of what we could accomplish in this world. Other honors flowed in. The French government gave him the famous Volta Prize, which had been awarded only a few times before. Alec used the prize money to build a laboratory, for you see, Alec's disciplined and searching mind was already thinking of many new ideas and ways of applying them. Over the next few years, Alec worked long and hard on several new inventions, and he continued to lecture to teachers of the deaf and help families with deaf children. One day, a man brought his blind and deaf daughter to see Alec. Her name was Nolan? Helen Keller. And her father was desperate. It seemed impossible to teach her anything. Alec took her on his knee and watched her as she felt his watch strike the hour. He was sure she could be educated, since he himself had no experience teaching someone who was blind as well as deaf. Alec directed Mr. Keller to a school that might be able to help Helen. Through the school, the Kellers found Anne Sullivan, who taught Helen to hear and talk and see with her hands. Alec followed Helen's progress, helping and encouraging her whenever he could. The two became lifelong friends, and Helen later said that without him, she would have been locked in darkness and silence forever. Meanwhile, Mabel was once again worrying about Alec's health. You need a quiet place to rest sometime, she told him. Alec's trusted little friend Belle chimed her agreement. And one summer when they were visiting Nova Scotia, they found the perfect place. It was near Baddeck on Cape Breton Island, standing on a grassy hill that led down to a lake. Alex said to Mabel, "It reminds me of Scotland, where I lived when I was a boy. We will build a summer place here and call it Bainbray. That's Gaelic for beautiful mountain." Summers at Bainbray did not mean just rest for Alec. He built a small workshop attached to the house so that he could do experiments. "Do you always have to work so hard and be so self-disciplined?" asked Belle. Alex smiled. Belle knew he could not be happy unless he was thinking up new ways of helping people. Watching the birds circle overhead, Alec pondered the question of how it might be possible for people to fly too. He began experimenting with kites, building ever bigger and more complicated ones. In 1906, four eager young men, excited by the possibilities of flight, found their way to Baddeck. One evening, as they all sat talking in the Bell living room, Mabel made a suggestion. "Alec, you have four pretty, smart young engineers here, and they're just as interested in flight as you are. Why don't we form an organization?" And that is just what they did. They built and flew passenger-carrying kites, then moved on to gliders, and finally to powered aircraft. On February 23rd, 1909, the Silver Dart flew half a mile at a speed of 40 miles per hour. It was the first heavier-than-air flight in the British Empire. Over the years, Alec's self-disciplined and inquiring mind took him from one invention to the next. It led him from kites and planes to boats to machines, that he could locate icebergs and take salt out of the seawater. He experimented with new breeds of sheep, wax, phonograph records, and air conditioning. He even invented a device by which doctors could locate a bullet or other metal objects in the body. But one of the inventions that pleased Alec the most was his machine that tested people's hearing. He hoped that by using it, doctors could identify hearing problems and treat them before they became serious. Alec was honored with many awards for his inventions. Perhaps the honor that meant the most to him was having a Chicago school for deaf children named after him. For a while, we think of Alexander Graham Bell as a great inventor. He himself believed that his most important work was teaching the deaf how to speak. Alexander Graham Bell never stopped asking questions about the world and following where answers led him. When he was asked to describe what an inventor does, he said, "The inventor is a man who looks upon the world and is not content with things as they are. He wants to improve whatever he sees. He wants to benefit the world. He is haunted by an idea." Because Alexander Graham Bell had the self-discipline to keep searching and working and trying, the ideas that haunted him led to some of the greatest inventions of all of his time. Not all of you can become world-famous inventors, but if you have the self-discipline to keep working to improve whatever you see, as Alexander Graham Bell did, you might find you can do more than you had ever imagined possible. The end. Whew, that was a long one. Both boys are asleep, and we're going to sign off here. Another good story. I'm not sure when the next one's going to be, but, probably take a night off. Probably come back with another one. This is like how many? Look at this. I must have done some math when I was a kid. There's math written on the back of this book. This series of stories. It's probably about 30 stories or so in these Value Tales series. So tonight was a good one. Value of Self-Discipline, really long. It's a long one. We're 44 minutes. So both boys obviously asleep and out. Heard a good story. Probably didn't hear all of it. I did, but we're going to sign off. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.